He utterly hated John Wayne. Now we know the reason why. He smiled on screen, but behind the camera, he despised the Duke. Two legends of the Wild West, and one of them swore he'd never ride beside the other again. This isn't Hollywood gossip. It's the untold truth of why Randolph Scott utterly hated John Wayne. Before he became the silent symbol of American toughness, Randolph Scott was something Hollywood had never seen. A true Southern gentleman in a town built on noise. He was born George Randolph Scott on January 23, 1898, in Orange County, Virginia. His family wasn't Hollywood royalty. They were old Southern aristocracy. His father, George Grant Scott, was a respected textile executive. His mother, Lucille Crane Scott, carried herself with the grace and refinement of a woman raised on tradition and discipline. Randolph was the second of 7 children, raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the air was thick with manners, morals, and the belief that a man's word meant something. He grew up learning restraint, how to speak only when necessary, how to let silence say what words couldn't. That quiet dignity would later become the trademark that made him stand out in a sea of swaggering movie stars. At school, he studied engineering at Georgia Tech and later the University of North Carolina, planning to follow his father into business. But fate had other plans. When World War I erupted, Scott volunteered, serving in France as an artillery officer. He didn't chase glory, he did his duty. And that experience, witnessing the reality of courage, sacrifice, and fear, shaped the man he would become. When he returned home, the world had changed. And when he later visited California, the bright lights of Hollywood called to him in a way he couldn't ignore. He wasn't drawn to fame. He was drawn to purpose, to storytelling, to the quiet power of character. In a town obsessed with noise, Randolph Scott would become the calm in the storm. Hollywood in the 1920s was wild, a gold rush of dreams, scandals, and broken promises. Everyone wanted to be a star, but Randolph Scott wasn't like everyone else. He started at the bottom, stuntman, extra, background cowboy. He learned by watching, by listening, by studying the craft like a soldier studies battle. His tall frame, piercing eyes, and that low, steady voice gave him something directors couldn't fake: authenticity. By the 1930s, Scott was becoming a name people respected, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he was real. He didn't play the cowboy. He was the cowboy. Films like The Last of the Mohicans, 1936, Western Union, 1941, and The Desperados, 1943, made him the face of the silent, honorable hero. While other actors fought for attention, Scott stood still, and the camera came to him. He was the man who could walk into a saloon, say nothing, and still control the room. But behind that calm exterior was a sharp mind. He studied every line, every gesture, understanding that true power wasn't in how loud you spoke. It was in how much truth your silence could hold. And in an era when Hollywood was becoming louder, flashier, and more commercial, Randolph Scott refused to play the game. He didn't go to the parties. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't need to. His performances became his legacy, slow-burning, emotionally layered portraits of men haunted by their past, but guided by honor. He wasn't just acting. He was redefining masculinity on screen. By the time the 1940s rolled around, Scott wasn't just a Western star. He was a moral compass. But not everyone admired that quiet strength. One man in particular saw Scott's calm dignity as weakness, and that man was John Wayne. Transition pause, slow dramatic tone. What started as professional respect would soon turn into one of Hollywood's coldest rivalries. For decades, audiences imagined Randolph Scott and John Wayne as brothers of the Wild West, two men carved from the same dust and sunlight. But off-screen, their worlds couldn't have been further apart. Scott, the Southern gentleman who carried himself with quiet discipline, lived by an inner code: dignity before drama. John Wayne, on the other hand, was Hollywood's loudest symbol of patriotism and pride, and a walking storm of charisma who could fill any room with his booming laugh. Their first encounters were polite, even warm. But beneath the surface, tension brewed. Producers and studio executives loved to pit them against each other. To the industry, it was simple math. Two Western titans, one throne. But to Scott, it was something else. A battle for what the West truly meant. Wayne represented the myth, Big, bold, heroic, larger than life. Scott represented the man behind the myth. Quiet, flawed, human. To Scott, Wayne's cowboy was all noise and performance, a salesman's version of courage. He once told a friend, "The Duke sells the West, I try to live it." At first, Wayne brushed it off, calling Scott's style too stiff, too polished. But soon the mutual respect turned into an icy distance. When they crossed paths at studio events, you could feel it, that invisible wall of pride between them. Crew members whispered that when one entered the room, the other would fall silent. It wasn't just about acting, it was about values. Scott's sense of manhood came from integrity and restraint. Wayne's came from dominance and bravado. Both men wanted to embody America's hero, but they defined heroism in completely opposite ways. And in the golden era of Hollywood, where egos were currency, that kind of difference wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. If Randolph Scott was the quiet storm, John Wayne was the thunder that followed. Wayne never hid his opinions, political, moral, or otherwise. He'd turn a casual dinner into a debate, his voice echoing down the table like a rifle shot. Scott hated that. To Scott, a gentleman didn't shout his beliefs, he lived them. He believed that honor was proven in actions, not speeches. So when Wayne started preaching about war, freedom, and what it meant to be a real man, Scott tuned out. Their differences finally erupted in a private exchange that spread quietly through the Hollywood grapevine. At a party one night, Wayne reportedly teased Scott, saying, "You look too pretty to play a real cowboy." The room laughed. Scott didn't. He set down his drink and replied softly, "Being loud doesn't make you real, Duke." The laughter died instantly. From that moment, the line between them was carved in stone. Wayne's version of heroism was wrapped in flag-waving patriotism, black and white ideas of good and evil. Scott's worldview was different. Having seen the gray areas of life firsthand, especially during his wartime service, he believed that true strength came from humility and understanding. When the studios later promoted Wayne as America's ultimate war hero, despite his never having served, Scott saw it as a betrayal of every soldier who actually had. He didn't despise Wayne for staying home. He despised him for pretending to fight wars on screen after avoiding one in real life. To Scott, that was unforgivable hypocrisy. Friends tried to smooth things over. Gary Cooper, Joel McCrea, and others often found themselves trapped in the middle, carefully avoiding praise of one man in front of the other. But by then, the feud had turned cold and quiet. The kind that doesn't explode, it freezes. Scott would leave a room if Wayne entered. No shouting, no insults, just a silent message. We don't belong in the same world. And maybe that's what made it so fascinating. Hollywood had plenty of rivalries, but this one wasn't about women, fame, or money. It was about the soul of the American hero itself, who defined it, and who actually deserved to wear that hat. Transition pause, slow and tense. What came next would test both men's legacies, and prove that silence can sometimes be the loudest revenge of all. By the early 1940s, America was changing, and so was Hollywood. While studios were churning out war movies full of patriotism and glory, Randolph Scott was watching the real heroes come home scarred and silent. He had seen the truth of war firsthand during his service years before. He knew it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cinematic, it was hell. And that's why what John Wayne did next shattered his respect completely. When World War II broke out, almost every leading man in Hollywood signed up. James Stewart, Clark Gable, Henry Fonda, they put their careers on hold to fight. But John Wayne didn't. He stayed. While others flew combat missions and lived through fire and chaos, Wayne stayed in California, filming movies and building his image as America's heroic soldier. He claimed it was because of studio obligations, but behind the scenes, everyone knew the truth. He didn't want to risk his fame. To most of Hollywood, it was forgivable. To Randolph Scott, it wasn't. Scott once said, "I don't judge men who stayed home, but I can't respect a man who plays a soldier on screen after refusing to be one in life." That quiet line, never shouted, never public, cut deeper than any insult. It wasn't jealousy, it was moral disgust. Scott saw Wayne's on-screen heroics as a lie, a betrayal of the men who actually fought and died. He believed Wayne had stolen their honor, turned real courage into cheap theater. In interviews years later, Scott never mentioned Wayne by name when talking about men of false bravery, but everyone knew exactly who he meant. To Scott, it wasn't about politics or pride, It was about principle. He had lived through real fear, real duty, and now he was watching a man parade around as a hero, cheered by millions who didn't know the truth. Every new John Wayne movie, every line about courage and loyalty, only deepened Scott's disdain. And while Wayne's fame grew, Scott's silence became its own statement. No headlines, no confrontation, just a quiet, dignified refusal to ever share the screen or a friendship with the Duke. In the grand story of Hollywood, that silence spoke louder than any feud ever could. Pause, slow, tense tone. But what happens when two men can't escape each other's shadows? The answer is colder than you might expect. By the 1950s, John Wayne was everywhere. He was the face of American patriotism, swaggering through saloons, winning wars, saving the day. He was the cowboy every boy wanted to be. And somewhere in Beverly Hills, Randolph Scott was watching, quietly, steadily, unimpressed. He never said Wayne's name in interviews, but people close to him noticed it. If Wayne's movie came on the radio, Scott would change the station. If a producer mentioned the Duke's success, Scott's expression hardened just slightly, not with envy, but disappointment. Even at social gatherings, the divide was legendary. Hollywood insiders whispered about it. If Wayne shows up, Scott walks out. It wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. That calm, polite Southern charm that had defined him for years was still there, just sharpened into quiet rebellion. Scott believed Wayne had turned the American cowboy into a caricature, loud, boastful, and empty. He told a close friend once, "Wayne made the West a show. I tried to make it real." There's a strange irony in that. Two men, both symbols of honor. One built his legend through noise, the other through silence. Gary Cooper once said, "Scott's the only man who could say nothing and still sound like he's telling the truth." And that's exactly what he did. For the rest of his life, Wayne kept talking. In interviews, in films, in politics. Scott stayed quiet, living in peace with his wife Patricia Stillman, raising his children, tending horses on his ranch outside Santa Barbara. He'd retired from acting at the top of his game, with his dignity fully intact. But make no mistake, he never forgave Wayne. He once said privately, "The last man I'd ride the range with is John Wayne." Simple words, but when Randolph Scott said something, he meant it. Theirs wasn't just a clash of egos, it was a war of ideals. And even though Wayne's name became the louder legend, it's Scott's silence that history now remembers. That calm, unshakable integrity that Hollywood could never quite imitate. Pause, soft closing narration tone. In the end, two cowboys rode into history. One noisy, one noble. But only one lived the code he played on screen. By the late 1950s, Hollywood had crowned John Wayne as the embodiment of the American West. He wasn't just a movie star, he was a symbol. The swagger, the grit, the voice that rumbled like a distant storm. To millions, Wayne was the cowboy, the soldier, the hero. But to Randolph Scott, that symbol was hollow. Scott believed acting wasn't about pretending to be something. It was about revealing it. He brought truth to the screen through silence, restraint, and the quiet dignity of a man who'd actually lived what he portrayed. When Scott rode across the desert in Ride Lonesome or Comanche Station, his eyes did more talking than 100 of Wayne's speeches. You could see the loneliness, the regret, the moral code buried deep inside. That wasn't performance. That was Randolph Scott. He didn't chase fame. He didn't chase applause. He chased authenticity, the rarest currency in Hollywood. And that's what drove him insane about Wayne. John Wayne had become addicted to his own myth. He didn't just play the cowboy. He believed he was one. He'd swagger through studio lots barking orders, tossing out opinions like gunfire, acting as if he were the sheriff of Hollywood. To Wayne, everything was simple. Good guys, bad guys, America always right. To Scott, that kind of thinking was childish, dangerous even. Because life, as he saw it, wasn't about who stood taller, but who stood truer. Friends who knew them both said Wayne admired Scott's calm. He envied it. But he could never understand it. Because Scott's quiet wasn't weakness. It was control. He didn't need to fill silence with noise or victory with volume. He knew who he was. Wayne didn't. It's ironic. The man who played all the loud heroes was haunted by the one who didn't say a word. Pause, reflective, cinematic tone. Maybe that's what hurt Wayne the most. That every time Randolph Scott walked on screen, he reminded audiences what real strength looked like. Not in how a man talks, but in how he stands. By the time both men hit their later years, their feud had turned from open tension into a cold spiritual standoff. They rarely spoke, never worked together, but each man lived rent-free in the other's legend. John Wayne, loud, patriotic, unstoppable, became a national monument. He gave speeches, endorsed politicians, and turned every movie into a sermon about American pride. People adored him for it. But behind closed doors, he was restless. Friends said that when critics mentioned Randolph Scott, Wayne's jaw would tighten. He'd change the subject. He couldn't stand the comparison, because deep down, he knew it wasn't just about fame. It was about truth. Randolph Scott, meanwhile, had retired gracefully. He didn't chase cameras or headlines. He had his horses, his faith, his wife Patricia Stillman, and peace, something Wayne never found. While Wayne was shouting to the world who he was, Scott didn't need to. His silence was his armor. His life was his proof. There's a story from the late 1960s, a charity gala in Los Angeles. Both men were invited. When John Wayne entered the ballroom, applause erupted like thunder. But when Randolph Scott walked in minutes later, the crowd went quiet. Not out of disrespect, out of awe. Even Wayne noticed it. That silence followed Scott like a shadow, commanding, calm, unshakable. They never spoke that night. They didn't have to. Because between them stood something no handshake could fix, the question of what it really means to be a man of honor. Wayne's myth was built on motion, charging forward, guns blazing, flags flying. Scott's truth was built on stillness, courage without noise, loyalty without show. And history has a way of remembering stillness. Lower tone, slow and emotional. When John Wayne died in 1979, Hollywood mourned its loudest hero. When Randolph Scott passed in 1987, the world barely noticed, but those who truly knew him said this: he never acted a hero, he just lived like one. Time has a strange way of peeling back the masks we wear. By the late 1970s, John Wayne was sick, but his legend had never been louder. America called him the Duke, the man who never backed down, the last cowboy standing. But behind the applause, there was a truth Wayne could never quite escape. The one Randolph Scott had seen all along. Scott's quiet judgment had always been rooted in one thing: integrity. And in Scott's eyes, Wayne had broken the most sacred rule of manhood. He'd played hero without earning it. You see, Wayne had spent decades on screen fighting wars he never fought, giving speeches about courage he never tested. He wore the uniform, waved the flag, took the glory, all while the real heroes came home in silence. To the world, it looked noble. To Randolph Scott, it looked unforgivable. He couldn't stomach the hypocrisy. The man who ducked the draft now shouting about duty, the movie star praised as a soldier who never saw a battlefield. Scott wasn't a man of vengeance, but he was a man of truth. And the truth for him was simple. John Wayne represented everything that had gone wrong with Hollywood. Loud, proud, and hollow. Even decades later, when asked about Wayne's patriotism, Scott said nothing. He didn't roll his eyes, he didn't smirk. He just stayed silent. And somehow, that silence said more than words ever could. Because deep down, everyone who knew both men understood what that silence meant. It meant disappointment. It meant disillusionment. It meant the kind of sadness only one real man feels when he watches another pretend to be one. Wayne's fame would outlive him, but Scott's quiet honesty would outlast the noise. Pause, slow, building tension. And maybe that's the cruelest irony of all. The loudest cowboy in the West was haunted by the one who never had to raise his voice. When John Wayne passed away in 1979, America wept. Flags flew at half-mast, fans lined the streets, and the press called him the man who embodied the American spirit. But in a quiet ranch outside Santa Barbara, Randolph Scott didn't attend the funeral. He stayed home, alone. No cameras, no statements, no tribute, just silence. Because by then, he had already said everything he needed to, not in interviews, but in how he lived. After retiring in the early 1960s, Scott had become almost mythical in his own right. He turned down interviews, avoided Hollywood parties, and spent his days raising horses with his wife Patricia Stillman. He didn't chase the spotlight. He let it die naturally, like a campfire fading under the stars. While Wayne's legend grew louder with every passing year, Scott's faded into whispers. But here's the twist. That was exactly how he wanted it. He didn't need a legacy sculpted in bronze or shouted from a stage. He already had something stronger. Peace. Real peace. The kind that comes only to a man who never lied about who he was. Those who visited Scott in his final years said he spoke little about Hollywood. But once when someone mentioned John Wayne, Scott just smiled faintly and said, "The West was big enough for both of us." But the truth was only big enough for one. That line, quiet, calm, devastating, summed up everything. Wayne gave America its favorite fantasy, the fearless cowboy who could conquer anything. Scott gave America something rarer, the truth that real courage doesn't need to be seen, it just needs to be lived. When Randolph Scott passed away in 1987 at the age of 89, there were no national headlines, no crowds, no parades, just a short obituary in the papers, and a lifetime of respect whispered between old actors who knew what real honor looked like. Fade to slow, emotional close, low voiceover tone. In the end, two men rode through the same West. One left his echo in every gunshot, every speech, every flag. The other left his truth in the silence between them. And maybe that's the real story here, not how Randolph Scott hated John Wayne, but how one man's quiet integrity exposed another man's loud illusion. Because in Hollywood, noise fades, but character, real character, never does.